Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. Hello, my name is Deborah Barkin. I'm the creative director of the Berman Museum of Art at Ursinus College, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's Berman Conversation, organized in conjunction with our current exhibition, Mapping Climate Change, the Knitting Map, and the Tempestry Project. We wish to thank the Kobe Foundation and Culture Ireland for their generous support of this exhibition, and the Schuylkill Center for Environmental Education for the loan of their traveling collection of Philadelphia Tempestries. We would also like to thank our partners for tonight's event, Ursinus College Arts and Lectures Fund, the Departments of Art and Art History, Environmental Studies, and Theater and Dance, the Museum Studies Program, the Office of Sustainability, the Parley Center for Science and the Common Good, and Culture Ireland. We will have a question and answer period toward the end of the hour, so please type your questions into the chat. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers this evening, Jools Gilson, Emily McNeil, and Justin Connelly, and our esteemed moderator, Leah Joseph. Dr. Jools Gilson is an interdisciplinary artist and scholar with a diverse practice that includes dance, choreography, directing, creative writing, podcasting, radio broadcasting, and scholarship. She holds a PhD in theater and performing arts from the University of Surrey and serves as professor of creative practice at University of College Cork. Currently, she is a Fulbright Scholar in Residence at the Atlas Institute of the University of Colorado Boulder. Dr. Gilson, along with her former collaborator, Richard Povell, conceptualized and directed the Knitting Map, which you see behind us, a durational project that integrated emergent technologies with the volunteer labor of over 2,500 hand knitters. Justin Connelly and Emily McNeil, along with their collaborator, Marissa Connelly, founded the Tempestry Project in 2017, spurred by growing concerns about the potential loss of climate data from the public sphere. Tempestries, a montage of the words temperature and tapestry, are hand knit or crocheted textiles that meaningfully and visibly represent temperature data generated by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association in 32 colors, representing temperatures ranging from less than minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit to greater than 121 degrees Fahrenheit. The project has evolved into an activist movement with presence in all 50 states, over 30 countries, and for all 7 continents. The Tempestry Project has been featured at the 2018 Creative Climate Awards and in the pages of Smithsonian Magazine and the New York Times, and currently here at the Berman Museum of Art. Dr. Leah Joseph is Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at Ursinus College. She received a Bachelor of Science in Geological Science from the University of Rochester and both an MS and PhD in Oceanography, Marine Geology, and Geochemistry from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Much of her research focuses on the investigation of aspects of climate and climate change during certain intervals over the last 70 million years through the study of deep sea sediment. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
All right, I'm going to do the quick check. Can people hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, wonderful. So thank you so much to Jools, Justin, and Emily for being here today, and thank you for everyone who has joined us to hear from our artists today. I'm so excited to get to talk more with them about their work. I've been to the Berman Museum a few times now since the exhibits have been installed. And not only do I really enjoy the visual of generally looking at them and experiencing them, but I also feel like I want to spend much more time to study them much more intently to learn the details and the meaning. I see data in them. And as a scientist, I want to learn the meaning and all the patterns, what they correlate with, and think about that aspect comprehensively as well. Since everyone may not have had a chance to see the exhibit, I'd like to start by asking each of you to introduce your exhibit for folks who haven't yet had the chance to come see it in person. Jools, do you want to start us off?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. So thank you, Leah, and to Deborah for that introduction. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity, especially to, even though it's online, to meet the guys from the Tempestry project who I haven't met yet. Behind me, you can see I'm sorry about this, I look like I've got sunshine on my chest, but it's just because it was a little dark in here. But you can see behind me the knitting map exhibition. You can see it a bit better there. And just in the atrium beside it is the Tempestry project. And I really love the way that the architecture of the Berman has been used so that you can be in and be looking at the tapestries and see the knitting map through the archways. So the knitting map is a project from 2005, and it really came about because we'd been working with motion sensing technologies and dance theatre for a number of years in the late 1990s. And this was all work with Richard Paval, and we became very kind of adept at looking at the movement of bodies and working particularly with sound and sometimes pre-recorded samples of poetic text and sometimes with music. So when we miraculously, we felt, got the designation as European Capital of Culture in Cork in Ireland, we were all delighted, but we wanted to come up with something majestic that kind of met that moment. So I came up with this idea of what if the women of the city rose up and knitted the sky and knitted the busyness of the city. And initially, because I do tend to dream technology that's impossible as a way to kind of find different ways to do things. So I initially thought of it as a satellite looking at the city, but we ended up using CCTV cameras, security cameras. And it was interesting because at the time, the guards, well, probably still now, they wouldn't let us look at the actual images, but we were allowed to look at the movement data. And Richard mapped that data onto complexity of stitch. So when it was busy, the cities that were generated by the system were complex, and when it was quiet, they were simpler. And the aspect of the data that's most relevant to this exhibition is the weather, which is the color of the yarn, which, even though it's not standardized in the same way as the Tempestry project, it's similar in the sense that we used color to document weather. Our project is different from the Tempestry project. And one of the things that's so wonderful about the Tempestry project is that they've standardized the colors related to the temperature, whereas we just made ours up because we didn't know, we didn't have any context for it. We used lots of muted colors, and we were really interested in, we have different datas of weather coming in. So it's wind, temperature, precipitation, and Richard combined those in ways that scaled them and related and mapped them onto certain series of colors. So at the top, you can't really see from here, but if you come to the museum, not soon after it falls down the wall, there's a big purple swathe, and that was all of the wetness in the spring of that year, and we had flooding. So you can see those kinds of connections. So that's the project. So it was very ambitious. We had a wooden amphitheatre that was could sit 20 people at a time, and we knitted every day for a year, and it was all volunteer knitters, and it's still miraculous to me that we managed even to finish it, let alone have all these exhibitions. And it's really wonderful to have this opportunity to show the work in Pennsylvania again, because it was here because Jerry, what's Jerry's last name?
Robinson Lawrence.
Jerry Robinson Lawrence, who came to see the knitting map in 2005 in Cork on her sabbatical, and she's based at Millersville University in Lancaster. And, you know, really because of Jerry, this connection to Pennsylvania has happened and resulted in 2 exhibitions now. And she just loved the project. And I know that she was here at the Berman quite recently with her sheep and her spinning. That was when I met Deborah, and Deborah's been just such an extraordinary kind of champion of the work, and we've written about it, and here it is. And I have to say that when I arrived on Tuesday morning to see the work, I was completely taken aback with how emotional it was for me to actually see the work in person, because it's been hugely challenging in lots of ways to kind of get it here, and then the install had to happen on WhatsApp video, and they've done such a beautiful job of exhibiting it. And it really is telling about this digital world, that as much as I've seen it, and I've seen so many photographs of the installation, being here and seeing it just hit me very strongly. And I have such a strong sense of all the mostly older women who knitted the work. And I was even in touch with one of them, Marion McCarthy, who knitted the entire edge of them in this kind of complex cable. So she knitted it for the entire year. I was just talking to her kind of just recently, and I was telling her that that was coming here, and I was thinking of her. So there's a real sense for me that the work ghosts all those thousands of women who made the work. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And Justin and Emily?
Go ahead.
Well, we started as, first of all, thank you, Deborah, for the introduction, and thank you, Leah, for moderating this discussion. And it's really great to meet you, Jools, as such as it is in this virtual space. And yeah, so we started just knitting climate data just as a way to help people hopefully connect with it and to preserve the data. As Deborah said, we were afraid of what was happening with online data at the time. And but I think the act of creating Tempestries, which are 1 year of high temperature daily data, knit 1 row per day, and then the other type is full year, centuries worth of data, 1 row per year. And those are also on display there at the Berman. And
so one of the things I loved hearing from Jools actually was knowing how many people participated, and there's just this sense of personal investment in that that's hard to get your head around. And one of the funny things about the Tempestry project is we actually don't really know how many people have participated or how many Tempestries there are in the world. It's sort of a little bit more of an ambiguous process, and that everyone is doing their own and keeping them in their homes or sharing them with each other. But I loved seeing the knitting map and just seeing so much of that in one place.
and the names of all the people on the wall next to it.
So it's really sort of a wonderful contrast between hours sort of scattered around the world and then this entire year of people's lives in one place with the knitting map.
Yes, I was really struck by that. But I think you've sold around the same amount of kits. Is that right?
We have, although people buy kits and don't necessarily make them all.
Yes.
So
I promise I'll make
don't really have any idea.
And we also have all of the information needed to make them online for free. So people are still making them without our involvement at all. And we we'll get tagged on social media when a collection of Tempestries goes up somewhere that we never had heard of,
Yeah.
which is pretty fun.
So actually that kind of leads to my next question, which was, I love to hear about the motivations right behind the projects, but I was wondering how those, from when you conceptualized it at the beginning and what you were trying to do, how that changed throughout the process and maybe continues to change as you go. What became different, or as the project grew, maybe had you think about it in a different way?
I think when we first started, it was I think Justin had ideas of it spreading more than I did at the time. But when we started, for me, it was just a very personal thing. We were knitting climate data for our particular area in Northwest Washington State at the time. And it sort of grew to incorporate more and more people as the years progressed. It's been about five and a half years now since we started it. And I think it's become more interactive with people. We put all of this information online for people to, gather their own data and knit their own pieces. But recently, and especially after our visit to the Berman last week, we are really focused on doing more of these workshops and sort of working directly with people. That was just a wonderful experience. So I think that's where we're pushing now.
How about you, Jools?
Well, it's interesting. It's not the focus of this exhibition, but it was the focus of the previous exhibition in 2015. But the knitting map became a very controversial project in Ireland. And it's difficult sometimes when we're out of that context to explain exactly why. We published a book about it, but in kind of summary, I think it was a combination of the fact that it was it was work that was associated with older women, that it was knitting, that it wasn't able, in the kind of popular discourse of the time, it wasn't able to be seen as something that was transgressive. It was only able to be seen as kind of fuddy-duddy knitting. And that may have been because, it's difficult to say, but it may have been because we were too close to a time when people in Ireland, mainly women, had to knit because it was a way to clothe children and family. And it was, in some ways, it perhaps represented a time of greater poverty. And now knitting is actually quite an expensive hobby. Yarns are expensive, and because of the textile industry internationally, which is another whole kind of sustainability issue, clothes are cheap. You can get them very easily, and you can get cheap knitwear because they're made very cheaply in the third world in general. It's a big generalization, but so that really impacted us for the first 10 years. And it's such a long time, 10 years. And it was so hard. It started happening the year of its making. And in the process of bringing the book together, the book came out of the exhibition in 2015, which focused and illustrated the controversy in newspaper and television and radio in Ireland. Because when you look at it on the surface, it was a really radically democratic project. We would teach anybody to knit. Anybody could walk in those doors. We were open every day. We once had, the entire crew of a Brazilian naval ship arrive. And if you came to Cork to see the City of Culture in that year, you usually came to us because we were open every day. So in terms of that legacy, one of the things that's been a real pleasure is actually it not being about the controversy. And what's another thing that's funny, I think in some ways I've only most strongly realized after coming here, is that after that exhibition in 2015, and especially after the book, the controversy has stopped in Ireland. We've moved on, and it's really important to me, and I think important to the knitters, that the work continues to have a life, and to enable conversation, and to be exhibited alongside the Tempestry project, a project that's been going for since 2017 with two young people who've been working on it in a digital realm and disseminating it through social media. That's a different planet to Ireland in 2005, when I think I had my first mobile phone, and I wasn't really using the internet much, and I didn't know and social media hadn't really arrived yet. So for me then, it's astonishing and gorgeous that the work is still alive, given all of its struggle. I'm getting better at social media. I'm usually a bit rubbish, but I did tweet today and say, or yesterday, and say, this darling has been through a lot, a decade of controversy, twice across an ocean, and here it is with 1,000 knitters and more ghosted in its pleats and folds. And that really is how I feel about it, that it has, whereas Emily was just talking about the community of Tempestry makers and viewers are disseminated, and who knows where they are. In some sense, all of the knitters from the Knitting Map are here in this space, because every bit of knitting that they made is here and is joined together. So it feels to me that that through a lot of struggle and difficulty and challenge, as well as pleasure, that the Knitting Map continues to surprise me. And so, and right now I'm doing a Fulbright research and development project in Boulder, Colorado, which is based conceptually on the Knitting Map. And I'm working also with textiles. I'm working back with performance. But I continue to be really compelled by the way that textiles tell stories. In this case, about climate, I'm working on a story of a bog body that was discovered in the year that the knitting map was made in 2005, and she was dug up by mistake by a mechanical peat digger and shredded. But when the National Museum of Ireland got all of the material, it was skeleton and textiles, and they got this textile archaeologist to come up to the National Museum and painstakingly piece together all these hundreds of fragments of fabric, and they discovered that she was wearing 5 different kinds of twill of woven fabric and probably some kind of shaggy cape, something woven with wool kind of in it. And I'm working on that story in relation to the peatland bogs of Ireland as a landscape that in their intact form hold more carbon dioxide than any other natural landscape in the world. Well, you probably know this because you're a scientist. But when they're damaged, they do the reverse, that they leach carbon dioxide to a very great degree. So I'm trying to make a connection between this story of this body and the body, the bodies of women or of femininity, and to make a connection between climate in the context of Ireland. So I can tell more about that if you like, but I've gone on at great length, so I'll stop there.
Sure. It's hard for us, I think, to look at the knitting map and see that controversy, right, coming from the US and not remembering what was going on in 2005 necessarily. So it's interesting to hear you talk about it. One of the projections in the Berman Museum right now also shows you doing some amount of performance art in relation to the project. So would you describe that and talk about that and how it relates to the project and the controversy? And
yeah. Yes, of course. Yeah, these are performances from 2004. So they're the year before we made the knitting map, and they were intended to develop, to communicate to people about the knitting map as an idea and to recruit knitters. It was very practical actually, but it ended up being a kind of piece of work in itself. So every month during 2004, I did a performance in a different space in Cork City, and they were public spaces, and I was playful and cheeky and had a fantastic outfit that the knitters had made, and tried to get people involved in knitting. And then afterwards we had a knit in. So they were in places like on the buses, they were on the back of motorbikes, they were in a gallery, in a shopping centre, in a shop, and I'd never done anything like that before. I mean, I'd done lots of performance. I'm a choreographer and a dancer by training, but I really enjoyed that playfulness. And I suppose it's interesting being accompanied in this space by seeing those videos looping, to remember the importance of those and the importance of playfulness and kind of cheekiness as quite a serious political strategy, as a way to get people involved and interested. And I feel pretty strongly about this to this day. And I'm working in Boulder with a colleague called Leah H, who is a professor, and she's based in theatre, but she's also co-rostered with environmental science. And she does a lot of work with teens and young people and social justice, and particularly climate. And during the pandemic, she collaborated with a whole bunch of understandably unemployed professional comedians, and then student comedians, to do climate comedy. And it might seem like an antithesis, that how could you, because we often think, oh my goodness, how could you joke about that? But there is a way to be playful and comedic about things that are very serious, and that actually those strategies can sometimes get access and communicate things in ways that that the bold science just isn't able to. So I'm just struck again, and actually Beth's just received another quite big grant to continue that work. And I've just been involved with directing a climate cabaret in Boulder, which is part of Climate Theatre Justice, which happens every few years, where they commission 100 5-minute plays. And for a year, people can put those on without paying to do so. So we did that. I mean, I only directed one little 5-minute play, but there were lots of skits between, and kind of comedy and playfulness. But there were things like reduce your food waste, and, you know, people dressed as food, and wind turbines are beautiful, and all these silly things that might seem giddy and nothing, but actually they matter. Because one student, for example, who had very conservative parents, when we did the debrief, she told us that they'd send her a video in front of some wind turbines singing that song. So the little silly ditty sometimes sticks. So that was what those performances were.
Thank you so much. And it links into you know, as a scientist who's been, you know, hearing about this issue for so many years, right? Part of what we also start to hear about is how to communicate effectively about what's going on in ways that we're not just talking to each other, right? We're not just talking to other scientists who understand what it is we're looking at. And I thought, you know, we're always trying to be better about our science communication. And this year has, you know, put even more pressure, both actually with COVID, but also with climate, right? More data reports are coming out about the need to act, and the need to act fast. And so it seems important to reach out, not just to the communities, but other venues and genres of types of people that can reach out in this way. So it's one of the reasons that I really enjoy your work. And I was wondering, you know, why you might have decided about textiles as a way to communicate that, and you know, how you feel it is as a like representation of what's going on in climate, what people can get from it. So I'll turn this one over to you, Justin and Emily, first.
We settled on knitting and textiles because I was the manager of our local yarn shop and knit a lot and knew a lot of knitters, and was able to rope in a dozen fellow knitters in our town to start making these. And we had been invited to include something in a creative knitting exhibit at the Quilt and Textile Arts Museum in the Pacific Northwest. And it took us a while to figure out, you know, I'd entered shawls the year before, a bridal shawl and that sort of thing. So we were looking for something new and a little more engaging with people, and had already been throwing around the idea of working with knitting and climate after Inauguration Day in 2017. That sort of rose to the top of our focus. And so we started knitting, and it turns out that a lot of people knit. And even people who don't knit know someone who does, whether it's a partner or a mother or a grandmother, grandfather. So it was really a wonderful way to get to connect in that way. And it just this very tactile way that wasn't threatening to people, that is immediately engaging, that is very pretty. You know, knitted things are just beautiful to look at. So it's sort of a non-scary, non-overly scientific way of engaging with people about climate change.
And also very engaging. Like, people want to engage with it when they see these beautiful stripes. They're like this fabric that you make. It's like, it lures people in a little bit, and then you hit them with the climate after that.
They want to come feel it. They want to know what the colors mean specifically, and you know what town it represents data for. And it's just a very just wonderfully personal way of connecting people to something that's pretty abstract for many of us.
Yeah. And also, I think it can be a kind of sneaky way to put it in their backyard. And like, here's a collection, like the Philadelphia collection, you know, it's like everybody in Philly can relate to that. And so it's like, you can go back through the years and look at the weather and remember storms from your childhood or different weather events, and sort of helps contextualize it within people's own lifetime, which I think is important about communicating what has already happened regarding climate change.
Good. I went to the workshop that you had where you found a way to do it for non-knitters like me, the simple Velcro strip that we could put colors on. And I assume that the kits are like this, which is you're not just telling people what color per year, but you actually give the data along with it, so that people actually have a chance to think about what it is, that
and
they're
explain
putting
it
together.
to other people too, which is a really wonderful thing about it, is you can share that information with others. In fact, just this afternoon we got an invitation from a professor at a university in Iowa who's interested in running a workshop for her. It's like a big 70 to 100 student lecture class. So I don't think we'll be going ourselves, but we're going to work with her on doing a similar workshop for her class. And as she put it, this is a big ag school. It's pretty conservative. So we're interested to see how this goes with her students. It's very different from Ursinus and Philadelphia in general. And, we'll see how that plays with people who might not already be convinced as much that this is a problem.
Right. And it's interesting because, you correlate directly color to temperature change, depending on what it is. And so it's kind of just a data representation, allowing people to make their own interpretations, but yet it's a way to really see the data in ways that correlate to cold and warm.
It seems pretty intuitive for most people, which has been wonderful. The blues are cold, the reds are hot. That's sort of a common understanding. It almost doesn't even need that much explanation. And really, that's one of the wonderful things about the warming stripes data visualization from Professor Ed Hawkins. And that's what our new normal Tempestries are based on, of course, but that it's just so intuitive. You don't need a huge explanation for it. You just need to know that each row represents a year. And as long as you know what the years are, it's just right there in the colors.
Thanks. And Jools, I know you talked about this a little bit, but you had more to add in, asking about, climate communication and textile use and...
Yeah, well, I even before the knitting map, I've been interested in textiles for a long time, and really primarily because of what they mostly have to tell us about women's lives, or people who identify as women or female. And so, but that's prior to the knitting map. So I made one of the first pieces of work that I made with Richard Paval was a CD-ROM project. Like, who knows what that is anymore? It was a very early digital artwork on a kind of solid silver disc. So I can't even play that anymore. But it was a really kind of big, complex site or a kind of artwork. And one of the sections, there was about 8 sections, and it was all about femininity and mouths, actually, lots of things to do with orality. And one of the sections was needlework, and I just got really fascinated. You know how when you do needlework, or if you thread a needle, you lick it and you put it through, or you're kind of breaking yarn, and or you're holding, if you're doing needlework, you're holding needles in your mouth. And there's this, I was particularly interested in mouths at the time, but it's just such an embodied thing, making textiles. And it's both kind of comes from a traditionally female realm. And of course, nowadays, it's so much more plural than that. And so I had made a dance piece called Spinstrin, in which the dancers learned to spin thread, and we choreographed with a spinning wheel, and I made up stories of spinning tops and reworked the stories of spinning fairy tales like Sleeping Beauty and the Greek myths like Arachne and Athena. And so it wasn't so to use knitting in this kind of huge way, as I did with the knitting map, didn't come out of nowhere, but nor was it specifically focused on climate at the time. And so since then, my thinking has developed more, and now I am really interested in the connection between climate and textiles. And just to add one other thing, so I'm working with a costume designer in Boulder, and she's in the Atlas Institute, which is a kind of new media and technology institute. And so she does smart textiles. And I'm really interested in sphagnum moss, because these are the mosses that make the peat bogs. And I've been doing lots of really close-up videos of moss, and I've been writing creatively about mosses. And she made this fabric, which actually, when another of my collaborators brought it in, it was kind of over his arm. I actually thought that he'd been out kind of gathering mosses, because it's all kind of this furry it just looks like moss. It's amazing, kind of greens and browns. So we've been experimenting with using it as a green screen, but it will be a costume, and this links to the kind of shaggy cape that was found with this bog body. And so when you use this little bit of, it's just a sample at the moment, but it can be seen as a green screen. So the green parts in it then somewhere else, apart from the dancer, can project video of anything. But in my case, it's this kind of close up of the moss. So all of which is to say that that could be used in a museum to educate kids or any of us about the connection between moss, bog bodies, and tactility, and just to kind of find a place to be playful, which gets back to me jumping about on the back of a motorcycle with a knitted helmet, because having playfulness as a way to develop work, but also as a way to think about how people might engage with the work.
And I know, Justin and Emily, you're thoughtful about the yarns that you've been using, right? I was talking to Justin when he was here about where they're supplied now versus where they weren't. It's a very different way than Jools was talking about it, but I was wondering if you could speak to that too.
Sure. So when we first started the project, we spent a couple months trying to figure out what yarn to use, what colors to use, what our temperature range should be. And it was sort of funny at the time. We lived in a very, very boring weather-wise part of the world. Our weather ranged from about 45 degrees in the winter up to 75 in the summer. But one of the things we wanted to do was make this accessible to people all around the world. So we realized that we needed to expand our range, thus the colors that Deborah mentioned earlier, the temperature range from colder than negative 30 to hotter than 121 degrees Fahrenheit. But also we wanted everyone to be able to afford it. So we settled on this really big industrial yarn company that is, relatively cheap wool. And they import their wool from South America mostly. And during the pandemic, they were just having huge supply chain issues. And so it sort of made us reassess what we were doing and what yarn we were using. And we got put in touch with a wonderful textile mill in Pennsylvania, actually, in Nazareth. And so worked with them to develop our own line of yarn that is pure 100% US sourced wool, and is milled to our specifications and is custom dyed for us in Philadelphia. And so it's been really wonderful working on shrinking our carbon footprint as far as shipping yarn all over the world. And it's been wonderful to work with these really old companies in Pennsylvania.
So now that you've both been to the museum now, you're not there at the same time, but you've both been to the museum now, and you've seen both works now in conjunction with each other. And so I was wondering, what you thought about seeing them both together when you're dealing with similar topics, media, techniques, and what your thoughts were on that. I don't know who wants to start.
So it's funny, I had not actually heard of the knitting map until we started talking about what we wanted to do. And one of the women that worked with us at the yarn shop is a huge fan, Jools, of the knitting map. And so she, of course, started talking to us about that. And so it's just been amazing to see our, again, sort of scattered around the world version of what you were doing, sort of encapsulating this moment for all of these people. Do you have anything about that? I mean, it was just wonderful. And I do have a question for you. What does the cable all up the side mean? We were so curious about what was so consistent throughout the year that it was represented throughout the entire piece.
Yes. Well, it was interesting because before we worked on the knitting map, we'd never done any kind of big community projects. And people spend their entire lives working with communities, and we were a bit giddy thinking that we could just kind of stumble into it and it would be a breeze, and of course it wasn't. In the sense that it was, communities are all kinds of everything. And but what we did have is we had a kind of core group of of really committed knitters, and one of them was Marion. And what's her last name? Just remember, because she was just texting me the other day. I've just got Marion, the knitting map. I can't remember her last name. So Marion is an extraordinary tour de force. She lives on the north side of Cork, and she's knitted all her life, and she was such a staunch kind of defender of the knitting map when it was kind of challenged and so forth. And she's an extraordinary knitter. And I actually don't remember how it came about. I think it was the manager, Kate, who sadly passed last year. But she worked with Marion, and we had this idea. It was originally designed that we would have borders on both sides, but we really only had one person who could really make that commitment and be there kind of regularly. And so she knitted it every day she came in. And so it's interesting, it doesn't have a climate, well, except for the color of the wool. It doesn't have a meaning in relation to the busyness of the city, because we decided that she chose to do that quite complex cable for the entire year. But it's interesting because it's something that that I've come back to recently, because I'm just in the process of doing a website, and I was just digging through old photographs, and they did lots of activities. They were extraordinary, these women. And, when we did get bad press or somebody would say something rude about us, they would be ringing them up and arranging for me to come in and meet these people and all these kinds of things. But one of the activities that they did was something called a Pied Piper, and they took that entire edge before it was sewn up, because they were made in strips and then it was latterly kind of sewn together. So they took that entire edge out into the city in the summer, so it was half done, and they got people to knit a bit, and they had performances around it. So for me, in terms of like what it means Marion's dedication, and it means how extraordinary ordinary women so often are. And especially, women who've had to struggle economically, and maybe in terms of education and things like that, and how they still to this day floor me, in terms of just their sheer energy and virtuosic ability to kind of knit something like that for a year long and be committed to the project. So yeah, that's what it means.
I love that it's a unifying thread through the whole piece. It just has that sense of tying it all together in a both literal with the cable way, and now the story behind it. Yes,
and I feel like that's only recently come to sit with me in a very real way when I was looking at all of these images, and that I realized, because I adopted a baby in that year as well as everything else in the October. And so I don't feel like I'd really sat with those images. And in all of the events that we've had subsequent to the making of it, Marion has always been there, always spoken about it. And as I say, I was just texting her about it being here and me thinking of her. So yes.
It's lovely, thank you.
One thing I really liked was there's a couple of pictures in a little display box. Probably
and one of them is of Marion, actually.
And one of them is of her. And then I looked at what she was knitting and the color change in her lap, and found where that picture was taken on the knitting map.
Wow.
It was pretty neat.
It was really neat to see that put together, yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Yes. Those photographs in the vitrine here, they weren't photographs that I had, they were photographs that I ordered from our local paper, The Examiner, and got sent here. So it's really, it's wonderful to see that. And it's great that she's here and has a presence.
I have one more question before we put it to the general audience for questions, and this is for both or all of you. What is it that you most hope that folks who come to the Berman and experience these works will take away with them?
I guess my hope is just connecting with our new reality that we're all existing in and coping with, and connecting with this sort of archaic form of displaying it. It's, knitting has been around thousands of years, and I think it's a really interesting study to use these ancient techniques to display, modern data generated from weather stations around the world or generated from traffic cameras, as the case may be. I just hope that it helps people slow down and take a beat to contemplate the way things are heading.
I hope also that people see community in the knitting map, but also in the Tempestry project. And I think they're structured differently, and one is more recent, but in both cases, community and ordinariness made kind of shifted in the light slightly to see how extraordinary it is, and that these ordinary acts of doing something with winding yarn around two sticks, or one stick, as I've now learned, one curvy stick, that might be revolutionary in a small way, but that in terms of making the kind of change that we need to do something about climate change. It can so often feel to most of us who are not running countries that it's impossible, that there's nothing that we can do, and that these processes feel to me like small acts of repair and of hope, and that it is always important to do something, even if it feels small, and that's the only way that things might change.
Thank you very much. That was all very wonderfully expressed. And I do hope that that's what we get from it. So I'm going to turn it back to Deborah for questions, but I just wanted to thank you, Jools, Emily, and Justin for taking the time to speak with us, and Deborah and the Berman for arranging the exhibits and having you all here. So I'm going to turn it over to Deborah again.
Thank you everybody. But if people have questions, and it's possible for you to unmute, can you raise hands?
Yes, I am able to unmute, and I hope you can hear me. Yes?
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I've really enjoyed listening to all of you this evening. One question that came to my mind is, at Ursinus, we have our core curriculum, and it's structured around questions, right, that we're asking students. And one of those questions is, how can we see the world? And one of the things that have struck me about both the Tempestry project and the knitting map is that was a way to see the world in both pieces. Different ways and different times, right, are displayed, but it was a way to see the world around us. But in your ways to display this, Jools, you had said controversy, had came to you, and the folks at the Tempestry project. I'm not sure if you've run into controversy, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you've handled, pardon me, controversy, whether you had expected it or not, right? As you were like, well, let's engage in this process and let's try to do this. That was a rambling question, but I hope it made sense.
How have I handled controversy? Well, it's interesting because I suppose that when we talk about climate and we talk about controversy, we often link it to climate denial. And that wasn't the nature of the controversy with the knitting map in its early days. It was to do with, as I mentioned earlier, it was to do with financial concerns. I think the femininity of the work. It didn't help that the two artists were of British heritage in Ireland. And I think it was also, it's such an excess of knitting, and it's such the combination of lots of older women and lots of knitting, I think, was just too much for the public imaginary. And also, I think the city needed a scapegoat in terms of being upset about what happened with other projects that maybe weren't commissioned during that year. In terms of how I handled it, I'm not sure I handled it particularly well at the time. I was quite upset, and it was personally quite devastating that something that I'd imagined as a beautiful thing, as an open democratic space, was being slagged off in the press repeatedly and for many years. So it was tough. But I also think that when, as artists or makers, if we put things in the public realm, then we have to take responsibility for them. And I always did, and I always defended it. But it was also hard, and I felt like hiding from the press sometimes, especially in the early days. So I'm really relieved that that's over. So I might pass over to Justin and Emily, because their work has much more explicitly always been connected to climate. So I don't know if they've had different experiences than me.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like we have not had as much controversy as we expected in a weird way. And maybe it's just we haven't taken our Tempestries to the right places yet. You know, we've taken them to climate marches on poles like banners, but most people at climate marches are already on board. So it's not like we're getting into arguments there.
I think I did an interview with the Weather Channel a couple of years ago for their Sunday morning shows, and I think after that we had somebody join our Facebook group and was
trolling us,
going on about climate denialism, and I think we just celebrated.
Yeah, it was like, oh, we're legit now. We got our first person arguing with us. And we've had people just mostly on social media argue or mock a little bit, but we're not creating the science, so it doesn't feel personal in that way.
Yeah, I mean, even just a couple of days ago, your tweet about the mega new normal going back to year one, somebody was mocking it as if it's,
right.
It's not done yet, so you can't tell how bad it's going to get in the last 50 years. But they were talking about like the little ice age or whatever, and
it's like
she's not even up to that part yet. So there's.
And then I think that the format of fiber art and knitting is just inherently non-controversial in that way. Now, the people that would argue about the science aren't interested in the knitting in the first place. And then the people who are interested in the knitting that we've engaged with tend to already be on board with the science. So we've been lucky in avoiding much controversy, but maybe we need to start protesting at gas stations and oil companies instead. So that could be next year.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you.
Kristen, we'd love to hear from you.
So thanks everybody for being here. This has been a really awesome talk. I'm a student here at Ursinus, and I'm, as many of you already know, I'm an environmental studies and art double major. So things like this are like my absolute favorite. I do have two questions. So one is more technical and the other is kind of like conceptual, I guess. But my first one is probably geared a little more towards the knitting map. Have there been any like big mistakes made while trying to make it? And like, how do you deal with that? Can you undo it? Do you just kind of keep going, or like, how does that work?
Yes, no, that was, yes, that's a very good question. So yes, of course, because people were complete beginners, and even people who were experienced might kind of make an error. And in a sense, with most of the time, if there weren't dropped stitches or it was kind of really major, we would leave it in. But we had permanent staff, so we had a manager and an assistant manager, and they both kept an eagle eye on the knitting as it was developed, because it wasn't just actually about mistakes. I mean, mistakes were obviously an issue, but the other thing that we had to manage is a similar amount of knitting happening on each station, otherwise it would all be wonky. So they would keep an eagle eye on that, and they would knit bits up if there were sections that weren't kind of behind, if you like. And if there was a real disaster, then they would undo it and redo it. But we would try not to do that as much as possible, because the point was that it was made by a wide variety of knitters of all kinds of backgrounds and skill. And the other thing that happens normally, inevitably with knitting and textiles, and you can see that in the Tempestry project as well, is that people have different tension. And so the amount of the length, somebody will knit 10 rows and it will be different to the next person. So they kept an eye on that in terms of trying to keep it similar.
That's great. Thank you so much. And then do I have time for a second question? I do. Okay, awesome. So again, this is a little more conceptual, and this is open to any of the artists if you guys would like to answer. So like I mentioned, I'm an environmental studies and art double major. And when I tell people that, they tend to think of those things as like very separate. And since you guys are all working sort of in thinking about the realm of science and climate change and things like that, but using art, especially textile, of course, to translate those things and connect people with it. Like, have you had experiences like when explaining the project to like outside entities or anything, sort of having that similar comment that those things are really separate, or maybe that's not your experience, but if you could just speak a little bit to that, I'd be really interested to hear.
If you look up a climate art hashtag on Instagram, there are thousands and thousands of entries. And I think that's really ballooned really in the last 5 years or so. And so there's so much overlap, and there's so much interest now in figuring out how to share science information in ways that people can connect to, emotionally, but also just comprehensively. So I think it makes perfect sense that you're double majoring in that, and that just
Absolutely.
Sounds phenomenal. So thank you for doing that as well.
And I think that we culturally have spent a long time with the sciences and the arts very separate, and just in the most recent decade or so, those have started to come together. And I think it's necessary for the general public's understanding of scientific topics to be expressed through art and other means. It's not just like people don't like spreadsheets and people's eyes just gloss over. And so it's really important to find more engaging ways to talk to people about the information that you're trying to get across.
I'm going to put that on a t-shirt, Justin. People don't like spreadsheets. No, I mean, I think, when you look back to the Renaissance and even kind of later than that, scientists were always artists as well. And it's a kind of later development that we've separated them so powerfully. And it's really not healthy. And it's all I want to do, really, is I'm just interested in finding ways to tangle with science and with, at the moment I'm looking at archaeology and the ecology of the Irish wetland peat. But I'm using the skills that I have in choreography and creative writing to kind of bring to that. But I'm not an archaeologist, and I'm not, I don't know that much about ecology. I'm just reading what I can, but I'm always interested in working with people who do have those knowledges. So I would, I'm going to finish up because there's a strange sound happening here.
Okay, well, while Jools is attending to the strange sound, I would just add, before we move on to the next question, this is the beauty, right, of interdisciplinary inquiry and creative problem solving, and models, educational models like the one we have at Ursinus, where we are asking these bigger questions and exploring these bigger questions from multiple vantage points, sometimes simultaneously. And I would invite you, I know, Kristen, you're aware of the Venice Biennale, the Global Contemporary Survey exhibition, but Venice is a city that is especially hit by climate change because of the rising water level and the danger that it poses to that city. And particularly 2019, climate change was probably the biggest thematic of the global artists as a whole, who are all taking on this question in one way or another. So I think it is really on the minds of people cross-curricularly and interdisciplinarily. You can tell those people to check out that hashtag, right?
Yeah, thank you guys so much. That was great answers.
Alicia.
Hi. I'm also a dance major and an environmental science major. So a lot of like Joel's work is really, really interesting to me. And I was just wondering if you could speak about like how you started to use dance in your environmental activism.
I'm struggling because I can't think of how that happened. I think I'm just a bit irreverent, and it seems to me that embodied practices are so needed in so many different contexts. And I think increasingly also as I've got older, when I was training and when I was a young dancer, I wanted to be a dancer and I wanted to do dancing. I wasn't really thinking of thematic or content. And it was only later on really that I started, and even in quite recent decades, that I've really started to think about my dance and choreographic practice as just another method of engaging with the world amongst others. So I think you were in my class today, is that right, Alicia? Yes. So for those of you who are here, I came into this senior dance composition class, and we were working with an old text that is about Irish natural dyes. So the plants that we used in Ireland maybe 100, 150 years ago to make different colors. And we were just working with the names of the plant and the color as a way to stimulate choreographic practice and gestures. But the reason that I was doing that is because I'm really interested in how to open up that scholarship, in how to think about it differently. And that for me, yes, it's a bit of history that tells us something about Ireland and how people used to dye textiles and clothes with natural plants, but it also links to today because all of those plants still exist. And when we do that kind of exploration through embodied practices, we learn and we engage with it in a completely different way. And I mean, Justin's fantastic epithet there, people don't like databases. Well, people sometimes they need to be provoked, or they don't need to, they can be, it's good to find surprising and compelling ways to be arrested by knowledge and understanding. And for me, the dance practice is one methodology amongst others. Now, it's interesting that here we are in the gallery in which I have not danced, and there's this very, very large object behind us that I would consider a choreography as much as a textile art piece because it contains thousands of minutes of people's hands moving, and that to think of that as a choreography as much as what we did, Alicia, in the studio today, I think is helpful because it remembers bodies and it remembers our humanity and our way of being in the world. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but for me, I don't see my dance practice as especially privileged amongst the different things that I do, because I'm also a creative writer. I also work in galleries and sometimes I make radio. Now, I know lots of people don't do that, but some artists do. But I do think it's helpful to think of our practices in an expanded way because we need community and we need connection. And these different bodies of art practice have their own sensibility and cultures, and it's helpful to be wise about those. Oh, in a gallery, people look in a different way. Oh, in a dance theatre, or in a theatre, people sit in the dark and watch dancers move. But it's very different. If I'm on the street on the back of a motorbike in my knitted outfit, people engage with me in a totally different way. So I'm not sure that's a helpful answer, but I suppose that what I wanted to communicate is that whatever it takes, with whatever you have, with love and with care, is what I will do.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
I would just like to add to that a little bit. I think just a little addition is that any way to communicate something with somebody is important, and like the audio piece for the Tempestries is just another method of trying to engage everybody's senses in a new way. And so if you're able to engage through movement, that's just as valuable as the visual medium or any other medium. And it's important that we have everybody pursuing everything all the time, especially in regards to climate.
Well, I think that is an excellent way for us to close. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening and invite you, those of you who are in the area or will be traveling to the area, to please come and see the Mapping Climate Change exhibition, which is up through November 30th. The museum is free and open to the public from 11 to 4, Tuesday through Sunday. So please come and see the work of these amazing artists and activists. And I'm just so delighted that they could be here and that you, Leah, could drive our discussion and that you all could be part of the audience. So, and please check us out on Instagram and YouTube and Facebook, and just spread the word. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you for having me too.